Among the thousands of missions carried out by the Allied air forces during the Second World War, few demanded so much from those who flew them as the low-level strike against the oil refineries of Ploiești. It was conceived at a moment when the outcome of the war still hung in the balance, when the capacity of Nazi Germany to sustain its armored divisions, its Luftwaffe operations, and its industrial production depended critically on a single region of fuel supply deep inside Axis territory. The men assigned to the mission understood this clearly, just as they understood the formidable defenses built to protect those refineries. They studied the maps, listened to the briefings, and saw the reconnaissance photographs that revealed row upon row of anti-aircraft batteries, smoke generators, concealed gun pits, and fortified industrial structures. They knew that their long flight would take them across hostile terrain with no possibility of escort and no room for error. Yet, on the morning of August 1, 1943, before dawn had lifted from the airfields of North Africa, they climbed into their aircraft and prepared to fly into one of the most concentrated defensive networks the war would ever produce. They did so not out of bravado but because the war required it, because their training and discipline led them to accept a mission that demanded the full measure of skill and resolve. The story that followed, complex, costly, and carried out with extraordinary courage, stands as one of the defining tests of the United States Army Air Forces and of the men who answered its call. The mission that the United States never formally described as suicidal but which many of the men preparing for it privately understood could destroy them began, in essence, long before the aircraft were loaded with fuel and bombs in North Africa. It took shape in the strategic assessments of the Allied High Command during a moment when the war balanced uneasily between possibility and disaster. By mid-1943, the trajectory of the conflict in Europe had begun to bend toward Allied advantage, yet nothing about that shift was guaranteed. The Wehrmacht still held vast territories. The Luftwaffe remained a dangerous and adaptive enemy. And, crucially, Nazi Germany continued to receive enormous quantities of refined fuel from the Romanian oil complexes around Ploiești, a resource that allowed German forces to maintain mobility, conduct large-scale operations, and sustain production at levels that prolonged the war. The oil fields and refineries of Romania were among the most critical strategic assets available to the Axis, and they were protected with layers of defenses that made any attack on them a formidable undertaking. American planners studying the problem knew that oil was the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare. Deprive Germany of fuel, and its entire capacity for maneuver, training, air operations, naval deployment, and industrial production would wither. Yet striking deeply into Axis-protected territory was not simple. The refineries at Ploiești were ringed by anti-aircraft guns of unusual density, arranged by German and Romanian officers who understood exactly how valuable the installations were. The terrain around Ploiești was flat, open, and unforgiving, offering little natural cover. Multiple smoke generators and camouflaging systems had been installed to conceal the refineries. The Luftwaffe maintained bases in the area. And the distance from Allied airfields in North Africa to the target zone tested the limits of the consolidated B-24 Liberator, the heavy bomber selected for the operation. Everything about the setting indicated a perilous mission, yet the strategic logic behind it was compelling enough that American leadership believed it had to be attempted. The decision to strike Ploiești drew upon the painful lessons of earlier raids. In 1942, a small force of B-24s had carried out a limited attack on the refineries, achieving some damage but revealing little about what a large-scale operation would encounter. German and Romanian forces responded to the raid by reinforcing the entire defensive network. They added flak towers, anti-aircraft artillery in unprecedented concentrations, radar installations, fighter detachments, and concealed machine gun positions. They built new obstacles, updated their maps, and anticipated the paths American bombers might choose. By the time planners for Operation Tidal Wave began analyzing intelligence photographs and reconstructions, the Ploiești sector had become one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in Europe. Any aircrew studying reconnaissance imagery could see the reality. Lines of gun pits encircled the approaches to refineries. Rail connections and roadways reinforced the region's ability to repair damage. Enemy engineers had prepared alternate pipelines and storage sites. The defenses were layered, overlapping, and deliberately configured to challenge bombers flying at any altitude. The crews knew that on a long mission deep behind enemy lines, with no fighter escort and limited ability to divert or escape, such concentrations posed mortal danger. Despite these risks, the mission became a priority for the United States Army Air Forces. American strategic doctrine in 1943 was still evolving, but there was a powerful belief, shared by leaders such as General Henry H. Arnold, that precision bombing of critical industrial targets could shorten the war. Within this framework, attacking the Ploiești refinery seemed not merely advantageous but necessary. For many officers in intelligence and operations, the idea that a force of determined and well-trained crews, flying at low altitudes to achieve maximum accuracy, could inflict crippling damage on the Axis oil supply was enticing. This belief, combined with pressure from Allied ground planning for future operations, helped transform a concept into a concrete directive. Training for the mission took place over several weeks at forward bases in Libya. There, under desert heat and dust, the crews of 5 bomb groups prepared for what they might face. Men of the 44th, 93rd, and 389th bomb groups, arriving from the 8th Air Force temporarily transferred for the operation, joined the 98th and 376th bomb groups already established in the region. Many of these crews had experienced combat, but most had not confronted anything resembling the scale or intensity of the defenses expected over Ploiești. They trained in formation, practicing the difficult task of flying at extremely low altitude in aircraft that were large, heavy, and constructed for high-altitude operations. The B-24 was a robust bomber with impressive range and payload, but at treetop level its size became a disadvantage, and the threat posed by small arms fire, flak, and obstacles greatly increased. The training grounds in the Libyan desert were inhospitable. Dust and sand infiltrated engines, instruments, and bomb bays. Temperatures soared during the day. The sheer physical and logistical complexity of preparing multiple bomb groups for a precision low-level strike demanded immense discipline and coordination. Crews practiced the approach to target areas mapped carefully from reconnaissance data, constructed mock layouts of refinery complexes, and rehearsed breakaway maneuvers to use after releasing their bombs. Pilots learned how to hold steady at altitudes that sometimes were so low that desert scrub seemed within arm's reach. Navigators and bombardiers studied maps, memorized landmarks, and practiced timing for synchronized releases. Maintenance personnel worked relentlessly to keep the aircraft operational, replacing engines, repairing hydraulic lines, adjusting cooling systems, and ensuring that each bomber could sustain the long flight ahead. During these weeks of preparation, a silent but profound understanding permeated the airfields. The danger was extraordinary, and survival was not guaranteed. Although there was no official designation of the raid as suicidal, the men could read the facts themselves. They saw the reconnaissance photographs. They heard the intelligence briefings. They understood the fuel load calculations and the lack of escort fighters. They knew that the route toward Ploiești and the return path to North Africa would carry them over hostile terrain without the possibility of emergency landings except in enemy hands. Veterans of earlier bombing missions recognized how much more lethal flak could be at low altitude. Even inexperienced airmen could see that a damaged B-24 struggling over hundreds of miles of enemy territory had little chance of returning, and that ditching in the Mediterranean after hours of flying was its own deadly prospect. Yet, for reasons rooted in duty, discipline, and the unspoken bonds among air crews, the men continued to train, refine their procedures, and prepare for the mission they would soon carry out. By July 1943, the operation intensified. Air crews were briefed repeatedly, reviewing the entire route from takeoff to target to return. Meteorological officers analyzed the patterns of winds over the Mediterranean and the Balkans. Intelligence officers studied German and Romanian responses to previous air activity in the region, seeking signs of potential adjustments in defenses. The mission planners decided on low-altitude ingress to avoid early detection by enemy radar. Although this approach would expose the aircraft to intense ground fire near the target, it offered the possibility of achieving precision bombing that might not be possible from higher altitudes. Planners also believed, though later events would contradict this, that low-level flight might reduce the time crews spent under sustained anti-aircraft barrages. As the date of the mission approached, crews performed maintenance checks that were more meticulous than usual. Flight engineers examined engines, fuel transfer systems, and turbo-superchargers. Gunners cleaned and inspected .50 caliber machine guns, aware that in a low-level mission the threat from ground positions, flak towers, and even small arms fire would be greater than anything they had yet encountered. Radio operators tested transmitters and receivers repeatedly, though they knew that radio silence would be essential during most phases of the flight. Bombardiers adjusted bomb sights and calibrated fuses. Everyone worked under a tension that grew steadily but remained mostly unspoken. In war, men often learn to carry their fear quietly. On the morning of August 1, 1943, before dawn, the bomb groups began assembling for takeoff at their respective airfields. The air was cool compared to the desert heat of midday, and the sky above Libya was still dark. Mechanics illuminated the ground with hooded lamps, finalizing checks on engines and fuel lines. Pilots and co-pilots climbed into their aircraft, followed by navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and radio operators. The sounds of engines starting reverberated across the airfields, one bomber after another coming to life. Oil fumes hung in the air. Ground crews signaled to pilots, cleared chocks, and stepped back as the aircraft began rolling. The plan called for more than 170 B-24s to depart from 5 airfields, assemble into formation, and proceed across the Mediterranean toward the Balkans. The timing was precise, designed to coordinate the arrival of the bomb groups over Ploiești in staggered but synchronized waves. Formations were difficult to maintain at low altitude, but the navigators and pilots had trained relentlessly for this. The long flight north began without enemy interference, but the challenges of navigation over open water and then over mountainous terrain soon became apparent. The aircraft maintained radio silence, relying entirely on visual checkpoints, dead reckoning, and pre-planned timing intervals. Crossing the Adriatic and entering the region of southern Europe, the crews observed the changing terrain below. Mountains rose sharply, requiring careful altitude adjustments to maintain both safety and concealment. The B-24s flew close enough to ridgelines and valleys that turbulence and crosswinds added constant work for the pilots. Some aircraft lagged, others struggled to maintain assigned positions in formation. The aircrews understood that the operation depended heavily on coordinated execution. Any deviation risked confusion when approaching the complex array of targets in the Ploiești region. Unfortunately, that very risk soon materialized. As the formations approached the vicinity of Ploiești, a designated rendezvous point before the final run toward the refineries, navigational errors caused significant divergence from the intended route. One group veered to the right. Another, following the misdirected lead, continued off course. The mission plan that had been practiced meticulously in Libya began to unravel. The loss of synchronization meant that the element of surprise would be limited, and the staggered arrival of groups might no longer coincide with the planned pattern of attack. The crews inside the aircraft saw the sunlight brightening across the Romanian countryside and understood that the opportunity for a coordinated, low-altitude strike had grown more precarious. Despite the navigational confusion, the leading aircraft pressed onward, descending to attack altitude. The low-level approach had been chosen partly to avoid radar detection, but by the time the bombers neared Ploiești, the defenders were already alerted. Spotters and signals intelligence had detected anomalies. Romanian anti-aircraft batteries were manned. German officers in the region began ordering their units to full readiness. On the ground, observers could see dust trails and hear the distant vibrations of aircraft approaching. As the first formations crossed into the heavily defended perimeter around Ploiești, the anti-aircraft fire began immediately and with astonishing intensity. Men who would later recount the mission described the scene as unlike anything they had ever experienced. Flames and smoke erupted from flak bursts almost at ground level. Machine gun fire laced the air from rooftops, towers, trenches, and camouflaged pits. The defenses had been configured expressly to challenge low-flying bombers, and now that design proved devastatingly effective. Some B-24s were hit before reaching their assigned targets. Others were damaged but continued on, flames trailing from engines or fuel lines, crews fighting desperately to keep their aircraft airborne long enough to release their bombs. The geography of the Ploiești oil complex contributed to the confusion. Refineries were clustered close to one another. Rail yards, storage tanks, distillation towers, and pipelines created an intricate landscape of industrial structures. Identifying the precise aiming points from low altitude required rapid decision-making, and the dense smoke already rising from early bomb impacts complicated visibility. Yet the crews pushed forward. Bombardiers released their loads over hydrogenation plants, cracking towers, boiler houses, and storage facilities. The concussive force of explosions rippled across the refineries. Black smoke began to spread, mixing with the haze from anti-aircraft fire. Some aircraft flew so low that their wings nearly scraped refinery equipment. At least one bomber clipped a smokestack. Others flew through columns of smoke so thick that pilots momentarily lost orientation. Navigators struggled to maintain situational awareness amid the chaos. Gunners fired at ground positions whenever possible, though it was clear that the defenses were too numerous and too deeply entrenched for suppression by the bombers alone. Losses mounted rapidly. Several B-24s fell in the vicinity of the target, some exploding on impact, others breaking apart as they scraped the ground. Crews who survived crashes faced immediate danger from fuel fires, enemy capture, and collapsing structures. Airmen trapped inside damaged aircraft fought to escape through flames and debris. Some made it out. Others did not. Despite the heavy casualties, many crews accomplished their mission objectives. Refineries were struck with considerable force. Storage tanks burned. Production facilities were damaged significantly enough that German and Romanian engineers would labor for months to restore them. But the cost to the American airmen was immense. And the damage, though substantial, did not permanently cripple Axis oil production to the degree planners had hoped. The refineries at Ploiești were resilient, well-designed, and supported by extensive repair capabilities. As individual bombers completed their attack runs, they attempted to escape the deadly ring of defenses. Some flew north or west, seeking to circle around to safer altitudes. Others turned southeast, hoping to reach the Mediterranean. Many aircraft that left the target zone were already heavily damaged. Crews contended with fires, failing hydraulics, wounded personnel, and engines barely holding power. Communications remained limited by the need for radio silence or the destruction of radio equipment during the attack. For the men in the air, the long journey home became a test of endurance, improvisation, and sheer will. Pilots fought to keep crippled aircraft in the air. Flight engineers redistributed fuel manually to compensate for broken pumps. Navigators charted courses using whatever instruments remained operational. Gunners tended to the wounded. In many cases, men used parachutes not for survival jumps but as makeshift bandages or padding for improvised first aid treatments. As the bombers crossed back over hostile territory, they encountered sporadic fighter opposition from German and Romanian pursuit aircraft. While the defenders had been caught off guard by the low-level approach, they now rallied to pursue stragglers. Some B-24s, unable to maintain formation or altitude, fell behind and became isolated targets. Others evaded pursuit through altitude changes and evasive maneuvers, though these additional demands placed further strain on aircraft already damaged by flak. Reaching the coast of the Mediterranean, many crews saw the expanse of water below as both salvation and threat. Crossing the sea was required to return to Allied bases, but any aircraft that failed over water offered limited hope for survival. The B-24 was heavy even when intact. A bomber damaged by combat might not remain afloat long enough for the crew to evacuate. Yet many reached the coastline, crossing the water slowly and carefully. At the Libyan airfields from which the mission had begun before sunrise, personnel waited anxiously, scanning the sky for returning aircraft. Ground crews, medical teams, intelligence officers, and fellow airmen listened for the distant sound of engines. As the first bombers approached, limping back with visible damage, the reality of the mission became clear. Some aircraft landed with holes in wings large enough to crawl through. Others had gear that would not deploy. Some slid along the runway, sparks trailing behind them. Medical personnel rushed forward to retrieve wounded airmen, many of whom had carried their injuries for hours. Then came the silence between landings. Hours passed with no additional aircraft appearing. The scale of loss became unmistakable. When the tally was finally completed, the mission had produced one of the highest casualty rates of any major American air operation of the war. Dozens of bombers were lost. Hundreds of men had been killed, wounded, captured, or interned. In the aftermath, those who survived struggled to process what they had experienced. The men knew that they had inflicted damage on the Axis oil infrastructure. They also knew that the cost had been enormous. American commanders began to assess the raid's effectiveness, evaluating the extent to which the damage would hinder German fuel production. Engineers and intelligence officers studied photographs and reports. They calculated damage estimates. They examined the resilience of the Romanian oil network and the capacity for rapid repair. Early assessments suggested that although the raid had caused severe disruption, the long-term impact might not match the magnitude of the losses. For the airmen who had taken part, the mission's meaning was measured not only in strategic terms but in human ones. They remembered the comrades who had flown beside them in the early morning darkness and who had not returned. They remembered the deafening explosions, the flames rising from burning refineries, the anti-aircraft fire erupting around them, and the weight of responsibility they felt in the cockpit, at the bomb site, and at the gun positions. They understood that they had been part of an operation conceived with the hope of dealing a decisive blow to the enemy's war machine. And they understood that the mission, though not labeled officially as suicidal, had carried risks that were visible to every man who stepped onto AB-24 that morning. As news of the raid spread through Allied channels, the reports emphasized bravery, determination, and sacrifice. The public heard of the mission's daring nature, its deep penetration into enemy territory, and the courage of the air crews who had flown at dangerously low altitudes to attack one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. But the crews themselves reflected privately on the cost. They thought of the aircraft that had gone down over Ploiești, of the men captured by German or Romanian forces, of the ones who might never be found. They visited hospital tents to check on wounded friends. They wrote letters to families, describing events carefully, often omitting details they feared might cause anguish. In the days following the mission, American units in North Africa returned to routines of maintenance, training, and operational planning. Aircraft were repaired. Replacements were requested. Crews reassembled, though many units were missing familiar faces. Discussions about the mission's strategic value continued at higher levels of command. Over time, more comprehensive assessments emerged, highlighting both the tactical effectiveness of the bombing and the limitations imposed by the resilience of Axis repair efforts. Yet among the men who had flown the mission, the significance of their actions remained deeply personal. They had participated in one of the most dangerous large-scale bombing operations of the war. They had endured circumstances that would test even the most experienced and resolute air crews. And they had demonstrated the discipline, skill, and courage expected of the United States Army Air Forces during the campaign to weaken the Axis war machine. The losses endured on August 1, 1943 shaped the character of American air operations in the months and years that followed. The necessity of accurate intelligence, precise navigation, and coordinated execution became even more evident. The realities of low-level bombing against heavily defended targets were scrutinized carefully. Commanders sought to apply the lessons of Ploiești to future operations, understanding that the cost of error or miscalculation could be catastrophic. As the war continued, many of the men who had flown over Ploiești participated in other missions. Some flew in Italy, supporting the Allied advance. Others returned to England to join the 8th Air Force in the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. A number of survivors eventually completed their combat tours and returned home, carrying memories of that August morning that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Operation Tidal Wave remained a point of reference among airmen for its audacity and its human cost. The mission demonstrated the extremes to which the Allied air forces were prepared to go in pursuit of strategic objectives. It illustrated the dangers of attacking fortified industrial targets. And it testified to the determination, professionalism, and sacrifices of the bomber crews who carried out the raid. Although not officially designated as suicidal, it earned that description in the private reflections of many who understood how unlikely survival seemed when they first saw the intensity of the defenses around Ploiești. The historical record preserves the operational details, the casualty numbers, the damage assessments, and the strategic analyses, but the human dimension, what it felt like to fly low over refineries under the full force of enemy fire, can be understood only through the testimonies of the men themselves and through the respect with which later generations have studied their actions. The first half of the story, from the origins of the mission through the execution of the raid and the immediate aftermath, reveals a complex interplay of planning, courage, loss, and resilience. The full meaning of Operation Tidal Wave becomes clear only when considering not just what happened, but what it required of the men who took part and what it cost them. The consequences of the August 1, 1943 raid unfolded gradually, echoing across multiple levels of Allied strategy, Air Force planning, and personal memory. In the immediate days following the mission, the airfields in Libya carried an atmosphere that was both subdued and intensely active. Aircraft maintenance personnel worked through the nights to salvage planes that had returned riddled with damage. Intelligence sections compiled after-action reports, interviewing surviving crew members, cross-referencing their accounts with aerial reconnaissance photographs, and attempting to distill the chaos of the attack into a coherent operational narrative. Medical teams treated severe burns, shrapnel wounds, fractures, and a wide array of injuries sustained during the mission, some of which reflected the hazards of low-altitude flying as much as combat conditions. The base hospitals quickly filled, and the number of wounded underlined the unprecedented level of attrition the units had endured. Within each bomb group, the absence of familiar aircraft on the flight line weighed heavily on those who survived. Bunk spaces remained empty. Personal items belonging to missing or killed crew members were gathered by friends and stored for eventual shipment home. Squadron commanders drafted letters to families, adhering to the formal and carefully measured style required by wartime regulations but carrying the emotional burden of acknowledging that a husband, son, or brother had been lost. The strain of composing such messages repeatedly over a short period left a profound impression on officers, many of whom struggled to fully comprehend the scale of what had happened. For those captured in Romania, the next stage of the war began in unfamiliar and often harsh conditions. Airmen who had parachuted from disabled aircraft or survived crash landings near the refineries were quickly apprehended by Romanian or German forces. They were questioned, processed, and then transferred to prisoner-of-war camps. In these camps, they lived under strict conditions, facing shortages of food, limited medical care, and prolonged uncertainty about the war's outcome. While the Geneva Conventions provided a framework for treatment of prisoners, the actual conditions varied widely. Some prisoners endured severe hardships, while others received comparatively stable care. Many of them spent the remainder of the war in captivity, their memories of the Ploiești raid becoming a mental anchor tying them to the wider struggle still unfolding beyond the camp fences. In the United States, news of the raid was initially presented through official communiques that highlighted the bravery of the airmen and the success of the operation. Reports emphasized the courage required to fly at low altitude into one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Civilian newspapers described the mission as daring and historic, conveying pride in the actions of American airmen. Casualty figures were mentioned cautiously and often incompletely, reflecting both wartime security concerns and the emotional impact such losses could have on families and communities. Many Americans learned about the mission gradually, through letters, official notifications, or delayed lists of missing personnel. Strategically, the Allied High Command needed to evaluate whether Operation Tidal Wave had achieved its intended objective. The bombardment had indeed inflicted extensive damage on the Ploiești refinery complexes, and production of aviation fuel and other refined products dropped sharply in the immediate aftermath. Fires burned for days. Storage tanks were destroyed. Key distillation systems were disrupted. German and Romanian engineers, however, began repairs rapidly, drawing on extensive pre-existing contingency plans designed precisely for such an attack. The Ploiești complex was not a single refinery but a network of installations, and the Axis had constructed redundant systems to maintain continuity of supply. In some cases, repairs required only weeks, not months. The initial shock to fuel output was significant, but the long-term impact proved less decisive than hoped. This outcome did not diminish the courage displayed by the airmen, but it highlighted the challenges of using conventional bombing to permanently cripple a well-protected and strategically vital industrial target. The raid demonstrated the limitations of even the most daring low-level attack when directed against an enemy capable of rapid, coordinated recovery. It also served as a catalyst for ongoing debates within the Allied command about the optimal tactics for strategic bombing and the most effective way to disrupt Axis war production. For many of the airmen who participated in the raid, the experience became a defining moment in their military service. Those who continued to fly combat missions did so with heightened awareness of the unpredictability and danger inherent in operations over enemy territory. Pilots and crews who returned to England or Italy for subsequent deployments found themselves comparing new missions to Ploiești, often noting that while other operations could be dangerous, few matched the intensity and immediacy of the low-altitude attack they had endured. Some airmen struggled with the psychological weight of survival, grappling with the knowledge that random factors such as minor navigation errors, momentary evasive maneuvers, or the angle of a flak burst had determined whether they lived or died. This was not unusual in wartime aviation, but the concentrated violence of Ploiești intensified these reflections. In the years that followed, historians, military analysts, and surviving participants continued to study Operation Tidal Wave, seeking to understand its lessons. One area of analysis focused on the navigational challenges that disrupted the original plan. The misalignment of formations near Pitești fragmented the coordinated attack pattern and contributed to confusion over target selection and sequencing. This led to renewed emphasis on navigational training, improved maps, better integration of Pathfinder aircraft, and advances in airborne radar technology that would later help mitigate such risks. Another area of study centered on the tactical viability of low-altitude bombing against heavily defended targets. The Air Force recognized that flying large formations at treetop level drastically magnified exposure to ground fire. In high-altitude missions, flak was deadly but more dispersed. At low altitude, every gun, large or small, became a threat. The defenders around Ploiești had deployed not only heavy anti-aircraft artillery but also machine guns, automatic weapons, and even infantry rifles, all of which were lethal against low-flying bombers. Future strategic bombing operations therefore emphasized higher altitudes and the integration of long-range fighter escorts as soon as such aircraft became available. Despite these analytical perspectives, the lived experience of the men who flew the mission remained at the heart of its significance. Each crew member carried his own internal record of the day, shaped by personal vantage points within the aircraft and the particular events encountered. Pilots recalled the intense demands of terrain following flight and the struggle to maintain control over damaged aircraft. Bombardiers remembered the fleeting moments when target structures appeared through smoke and haze. Navigators reconstructed the route in their minds, replaying the decisions that led to deviations or corrections. Gunners recounted the overwhelming volume of ground fire and the responsibility of defending their aircraft under impossible conditions. Radio operators reflected on the silence that characterized much of the mission, broken only by the internal communication systems of their own aircraft. Flight engineers reviewed the technical improvisations required to keep aircraft functioning despite catastrophic damage. Some of the most enduring accounts came from those who observed the mission from positions outside the aircraft themselves, ground crew members who watched the bombers depart and return, medical personnel who tended to the wounded, or intelligence officers who pieced together the operational history. Their perspectives added contextual depth to the story, demonstrating that the sacrifice and danger of Ploiești extended beyond those who flew. The mission was a collective effort involving planners, technicians, mechanics, logisticians, and support staff who enabled the bombers to take off and who bore witness to the consequences. As the war progressed and eventually turned decisively in favor of the Allies, the lessons of Ploiești informed broader strategic decisions. The Allied bombing campaign over Europe increased dramatically in scale and sophistication. Long-range fighter escorts, especially the P-51 Mustang, eventually allowed daylight bombing raids deep into Germany with significantly reduced bomber losses. Technological advances such as improved bomb sights, radar navigation systems, and communication protocols enhanced accuracy and coordination. The combined bomber offensive of 1944 and 1945 applied sustained pressure on German industrial production, transportation networks, and fuel supplies, contributing materially to the weakening of the Axis war effort. Within this larger campaign, Ploiești remained a unique case study. It demonstrated the potential impact of a concentrated strike on a strategic target but also illustrated the limitations of such operations when enemy defenses were well prepared and deeply entrenched. The refineries were attacked again later in the war, but these subsequent raids employed different tactics, including high-altitude bombing supported by fighter escorts. These missions collectively inflicted cumulative damage that eventually limited German fuel production significantly, but the cost of achieving such results through the 1943 low-level attack had been extraordinarily high. After the war ended, veterans of Operation Tidal Wave returned home to a country experiencing profound relief and optimism. Many resumed civilian careers or pursued new paths in education, industry, agriculture, or public service. Some continued military service, contributing to the post-war evolution of the United States Air Force as an independent branch. For all of them, however, the memory of Ploiești remained vivid. Reunion groups formed years later, allowing survivors to reconnect, share stories, and remember those who had not come home. At these gatherings, the conversation often turned to the men who had flown beside them, to the aircraft that had failed to return, and to the bond forged under circumstances too intense to fully explain to those who had not experienced them. In these post-war reflections, many veterans acknowledged that while the mission had not carried an official designation as suicidal, they and their comrades had recognized the risks clearly. They had understood that flying low-level into such a heavily defended target challenged the limits of survival. That they proceeded anyway reflected a combination of duty, training, discipline, and the shared resolve that characterized the bomber crews of the United States Army Air Forces during the conflict. Their participation was not driven by a desire for recognition or heroism in the abstract but by the conviction that defeating the Axis powers required the utmost effort from all who served. The historical treatment of Operation Tidal Wave evolved as more information became available. In the immediate post-war years, many details remained classified or overlooked. As archival materials were declassified, historians were able to construct more comprehensive accounts. They analyzed mission planning documents, operational orders, debrief reports, German and Romanian defensive records, aerial reconnaissance imagery, and participant testimonies. These sources allowed scholars to more accurately reconstruct the mission's execution, assess its strategic impact, and place it within the broader context of Allied air operations. Through decades of study, a consistent theme emerged. The raid represented a convergence of planning ambition, tactical audacity, and human resilience confronting overwhelming defensive firepower. Some historians characterized the mission as flawed in conception, arguing that the risks inherent in low-altitude bombing outweighed the potential benefits. Others emphasized the necessity of attempting to disrupt Axis fuel production and the unavoidable reality that wartime decisions often required taking extreme risks. Most agreed that the courage displayed by the participants remained beyond question. In the communities where the fallen airmen were buried or memorialized, families, and neighbors honored their service. For many relatives, the war had taken young men at the beginning of their adult lives, leaving behind incomplete stories and unfulfilled futures. Memorial plaques, cemetery markers, and local commemorations served as tangible reminders of their sacrifice. In some towns, streets or public buildings were later named in honor of individuals who died at Ploiești. For families of missing airmen whose remains were never recovered, the absence left a particular kind of silence, filled only with the knowledge that their loved ones had given everything in the attempt to achieve a vital strategic goal. In the decades that followed, aviation museums, military history institutions, and veterans organizations documented the events of August 1, 1943 through exhibits, oral histories, archival collections, and educational programs. Restored B-24 aircraft became focal points for discussions about the war, allowing new generations to visualize the scale and structure of the bombers that had flown across the Mediterranean and into the defenses of Romania. Visitors could stand inside a restored fuselage, see the narrow catwalks and gun positions, and imagine the conditions under which crews had operated during the raid. These exhibits often accompanied narrative panels recounting the bravery of the airmen, the challenges of the mission, and the enduring lessons of Ploiești. Some veterans contributed personal accounts to oral history projects, describing the events with clarity, humility, and understated emotion. They rarely framed their actions in terms of heroism. Instead, they emphasized teamwork, preparation, and the shared commitment that allowed crews to function under intense pressure. Many of them downplayed their individual roles, speaking instead about their fellow airmen, particularly those who did not return. Their testimonies conveyed both pride in the mission and sorrow for the losses, reflecting a perspective shaped by lived experience rather than abstract analysis. The mission eventually became embedded in the broader narrative of World War II aviation history. It illustrated the evolution of air power doctrine, the strategic importance of oil production, and the complexities of executing long-range precision bombing under wartime conditions. It remained a subject of study in military academies and war colleges, serving as a case study in planning, execution, risk assessment, and adaptation to enemy defenses. The lessons drawn from Ploiești influenced post-war thinking about air power, including the development of more advanced navigation systems, improved defensive capabilities for aircraft, and the strategic integration of intelligence and reconnaissance in mission planning. From a broader historical perspective, the raid also highlighted the interplay between technological capability and human endurance. The B-24 Liberator was a remarkable aircraft for its time, offering long range and substantial payload capacity. Yet technology alone could not determine success or prevent loss. The outcome depended heavily on human judgment, skill, and perseverance. Pilots needed to control aircraft flying at extremely low altitudes while navigating unpredictable hazards. Navigators needed to adjust course rapidly when deviations occurred. Bombardiers needed to identify critical target components under conditions of smoke and confusion. Gunners needed to defend the aircraft against dense and varied ground fire while maintaining situational awareness. Flight engineers needed to diagnose and manage mechanical failures under conditions far beyond those anticipated in training. Each role was essential, and each required expertise and composure. As veterans aged and the war receded further into history, the responsibility of preserving the memory of Operation Tidal Wave shifted increasingly to historians, educators, and descendants. Their role became not only to recount the details of the mission but also to communicate the human dimension, the courage, the loss, the resilience, and the sense of duty that defined the airmen who flew that day. Oral histories, letters, photographs, and mission records served as primary sources, but the emotional truth of the mission was often conveyed through the understated observations and reflections of those who had survived it. By the time the last living veterans reached advanced age, many of them had participated in commemorations marking major anniversaries of the raid. These events brought together family members, historians, and military representatives, creating spaces for shared remembrance. Veterans who attended spoke not of glory or triumph but of the men who had not returned, emphasizing that their legacy belonged to those who had lost their lives as much as to those who had survived. The sense of loss remained palpable even after decades, reflecting the enduring emotional weight carried by those who had witnessed the destruction around Ploiești. In retrospect, Operation Tidal Wave stands as a testament to the extremes of wartime obligation. It was a mission conducted with full awareness of its dangers, yet pursued with the conviction that the potential impact justified the risk. It reflected the strategic urgency of the mid-war period, when the outcome of the conflict still depended on the ability of the Allies to disrupt key elements of the Axis war machine. It demonstrated the resolve of American airmen to engage formidable defenses in the pursuit of strategic objectives. And it underscored the human costs of such determination. The fact that the United States did not officially classify the raid as suicidal does not lessen the understanding shared among the men who flew it. They knew that survival required skill, luck, and cohesion. They understood that flying at treetop level into a fortified industrial zone represented an exceptional test of nerve and professionalism. They recognized that a single flak burst, a momentary navigational error, or a mechanical malfunction could mean destruction. Yet they carried out the mission with discipline and courage, embodying the qualities expected of aircrew during a war that demanded extraordinary commitment from those who served. For historians, the story of Ploiești continues to provide insight into the operational and human elements of airpower during World War II. It offers lessons about planning, risk assessment, and the limitations of technology. It highlights the importance of intelligence, training, and adaptability. Above all, it reminds us that behind every mission, no matter how strategically conceived, stand individuals whose actions are shaped by duty, camaraderie, and the realities of war. In studying these events, one gains a deeper appreciation for the men who flew through the smoke, fire, and defenses of Ploiești, and for those who supported them on the ground. Their actions form part of a larger narrative of sacrifice and determination that defined the Allied effort in the Second World War. The mission exemplifies the quiet, steadfast resolve that characterized so many operations during the conflict. It serves as a reminder that even in the most challenging circumstances, individuals can display remarkable courage and professionalism. As time continues to pass and the generation that fought World War II gradually leaves living memory, it becomes more important to preserve their stories accurately and respectfully. Operation Tidal Wave, with its combination of strategic ambition, tactical complexity, and human sacrifice, deserves its place in this enduring record. It stands not merely as a dramatic episode in military history but as a testament to the men who flew into extreme danger because the war demanded it. Their courage, loss, and resilience form a legacy that continues to resonate across generations. In the final accounting, the raid on Ploiești remains what it was on the morning of August 1, 1943, a mission undertaken with the highest stakes, shaped by the strategic imperatives of the time, and carried out by airmen whose professionalism and bravery left an indelible mark on the history of the Second World War. They did not consider themselves heroes in the abstract. They saw themselves as part of a larger effort, fulfilling roles assigned to them, supporting one another, and doing what the circumstances required. The mission's legacy is therefore not only a story of destruction and loss but also a story of courage, duty, and endurance. Though the United States did not designate Operation Tidal Wave as a suicidal mission, history acknowledges that it carried risks well beyond those normally accepted in strategic bombing operations of the period. The men who flew it understood these risks clearly. Their willingness to proceed reflects the highest levels of commitment and sacrifice. Remembering them accurately and respectfully ensures that their actions, experiences, and losses continue to be honored by future generations.